every time in war.
An ambulance isn't held at checkpoint.
A wounded person isn't denied treatment.
A captured soldier isn't cut off from his family.
And aid isn't blocked.
A warring party is upholding the Geneva Conventions.
Amidst the horror of war, it's hard to know the suffering prevented by the Geneva Conventions.
But there are the one set of rules
All countries in the world have agreed to.
that limits suffering in war and reflect compassionate principles from many religions and cultures.
Because the path to peace is far more likely
When war has been fought within the limits of the law, international humanitarian law.
Yes, a warm welcome to all of you who have joined us here in Stockholm in Kulturhuset today, and a warm welcome to you who is listening in digitally online. We're here for a conversation today on how to safeguarding the rule-based world order. And to open our conversation, I welcome the Swedish Red Cross Secretary General Ulrika Moder.
Thank you, Josephine, and great to see so many interested people in the room and hopefully also online. This week marks the 80th year after the end of the Second World War, and one could ask, what would people have said who experienced the horrors of the Second World War? What kind of advice would they give us? But we don't need to ask them. We can just ask the many, many people, the children, the mothers of the world who live in a world with an increasing number of increasingly protracted conflicts that we see, and where the suffering is there as we speak now. And this is, of course, a reason for us to, in the days that we are in, to remind ourselves that we need to find ways to uphold the rule-based world order. And we need to remind ourselves that the rules that actually were seeded by Henri Dunant, who was born on the 8th of March, because tomorrow is the Red Cross Day, they were there so many years ago, centuries ago, in the 19th century. And of course, with all the knowledge we have, we need to do the right thing. And this is also what Swedes tells us to do. We have done a survey that we published today, and where we see that 9 out of 10 Swedes are actually really familiar and aware about the international humanitarian law and rules. And they also ask politicians in Sweden, but also, of course, across the world, to see to how to uphold them. Because what we know, and we will speak more about that today, is that if they are upheld way much better than they are now, then it's actually easier, because at one point in time we will actually see some kind of end, some kind of negotiated end to the conflict, that this will be done in a way that is more inclusive and that will lead to more lasting peace and hopefully also prosperity. So what we will listen into today is incredibly important, and I hope that you will also look into what we have to share on our website, through our social media, with regards to the survey we have done, the work we do as part of the truly international network with all our colleagues, and not least the 14 million volunteers of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement who are fighting the fight for humanitarian values in the front line of all these conflicts. And as you know, they fight with their lives, and we have never seen so many humanitarians killed as they do their service for the international community as we did last year, and already this year a record number. Some weeks ago, we had 8 colleagues of the Palestinian Red Crescent killed as they were trying to do their service close to the Rafah border in Gaza. We do this for them. We do this for the many, many humanitarians who have lost their lives, but we also, of course, do it not least for all the people, all the children who need to have hope for a better world. So very much looking forward to this. This is not theory. This is very much practice, and I think we will hear more of that today. But to make practice work as it should, we really need to know how to use the rules of not the game, but the rules of the world order that we've decided upon. So very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ulrika. Yes, my name is Josefin Karlsson, and I'm head of comms at the Swedish Red Cross. That means that I am not an IHL expert, international humanitarian law. So I will be making sure that we don't end up in an acronym discussion, but as you said, talking about reality. But we have some distinguished experts joining us for this conversation. First, let me welcome Laurent Giselle. You are the ICRC Head of Arms and Conduct of Hostilities Unit at the Legal Division of the International Committee of the Red Cross. You work to reaffirm, clarify, and strengthen international humanitarian law. Important work. And Sally Longsworth, you are working with the Swedish Defence Research Agency, FOI in Swedish, doing the same, I'd say, but from a research perspective. So a warm welcome to this conversation. And Ulrika opened up talking about why the Red Cross movement is doing this and why we as the Swedish Red Cross, as part of that movement, wants to address these questions, not least this week with the anniversaries. And I wanted to open up just so that we're all on the same page, or paint the picture of in what context we're having these discussions. In recent conflicts across the world, we've observed worrying trends when it comes to the conduct of parties of the conflicts. How do you, sitting where you are with the ICRC, with your net right into these conflicts, how do you view these trends, Laurent?
Thank you for raising that point, and also thank you for inviting us and organizing actually this symposium, which is extremely timely and important. What I could say in the trends, we very much echo what you just mentioned, because we see the same trends all over the world, of course, with devastating consequences for civilians, for humanitarian workers, as you mentioned, for essential services, for hospitals. And we see a lack of compliance with IHL, and I will also come to that. Permissive views being expressed, which is a lot of concerns for us. So what we view is that the human toll of conflicts today around the world globally, more in some countries than in others, more in some conflicts than in others, but globally around the world, that's unacceptable. Civilians are being killed, civilians are being injured daily or main in every conflict, and that's particularly the case when heavy explosive weapons are used in populated area, that we see increasingly the case. Sometimes they even deliberately target essential civilian services with devastating long-term consequences for the delivery of services for the civilian populations, leading to displacement, hospitals being damaged or put out of use, and as you mentioned, humanitarian workers being killed as never before around the world. But the second aspect I wanted to highlight is that we have also seen a shift in the discourse around from the belligerents, and a very worrying trend into arguing for actually permissive interpretation of international humanitarian law. Understanding the law as allowing many of the things that we see today. And from our perspective, I would say it's as worrying, even if not more worrying than the actual consequences. Why do I dare to say so, comparing violation of the law to people being killed? It's because that actually would represent the idea that what is being done today is acceptable. what is being occurring today in armed conflict would not be prohibited by the law. Well, actually, there is a huge issue in terms of compliance with the law. The law is meant to prevent what we see today in armed conflict. So the argument being made that actually this would be lawful is extremely concerning in the long term to prevent the suffering that we see today. There are lots of things that we can do with that respect, but maybe we can come
we
to
can
that.
come
So I'm sure we'll
back
come
to that. I think I
later.
just want to paint kind of this broader pictures, and you're talking about two different trends. That we're seeing more civilians hurt. We're seeing what you mentioned, humanitarian workers, but also this how we then talk about what is happening. You said
Permissive view.
permissive view. Is this something that you recognize? And I'm also interested because we're talking about trends, like, and you're saying there's been a shift. So when did this shift start? Is it tangible, or has it been like a slow shift towards this more like permissive way of talking about what is actually happening?
I think you could go as far back as the second Iraq interventions in 2001 and 9/11, and we see a major change in international law and the perspective of states. But I mean, you can go even further back to humanitarian intervention in the 1990s and the discussions then. So I think this is part of a change and a trend that we are seeing, and that change being critical. But I do want to put this in a broader perspective, because I mean, this is not only something we're seeing within international humanitarian law, it's in international law broadly. Obviously, the impacts when it comes to violations of IHL, though, are very different. But I do think it's important in thinking about the rule-based order to recognize that states are not ready to give up on the rule-based order yet. We've seen in response to statements by the United States president, for example, which have indicated a change, and as you say, a more permissive interpretation, if you used to put it kindly. We've seen direct responses from other allies where they explicitly referenced the rule-based order. We've had the General Assembly pass the Pact for the Future, in which they reaffirm fundamental commitments and universally accepted norms on the prohibition of chemical weapons and biological weapons and the use of nuclear weapons as well. And states are also still signing up to these IHL and disarmament treaties. So the Marshall Islands ratified the Ottawa Convention in March 2025. The UK signed the CCW Protocol on Explosive Remnants in 2024. There are many other examples of this. So the states have not given up yet on this. But as I said, this doesn't mean we're not in a period of change. And how we react to that change is important, because change impacts on the development and the definition of these obligations that we're talking about. So these treaties, or some of these treaties, some, not all, do permit withdrawal. So it is permitted within the treaty regime to withdraw from certain of these treaties, not all, as I said. There has been a tendency to see that as a threat to the rule of law in international law. But I think we need to put that in context as well, of thinking about the difference between international law and domestic law. We understand in domestic law, legislation can change. The same is true within international law, but what change and how we react to change is key. And the role of us as lawyers to engage in that debate, I think, is also critical.
I think we can come back also to the withdrawal to treaties, etc., and what that means, and perhaps linking that to this more permissive dialogue or discussion. But would you agree with Laurent that that is perhaps almost worse, if I quote you correctly, that trend?
Well, I think within the international legal system broadly, these changes of how we interpret norms is extremely concerning. And especially, we've seen even today with the Indian Air Force against the against Kashmir, in the reference to attacks against terrorist objects. And the way that states have used words and consistently are using words to kind of change and bend and, as you say, interpret in a much more broader and expansive way things that should not be included and are in fact violations. What's critical within the international legal system is how other states react. And I think that is one of the key weaknesses we have at the moment. And it's a critique that has gone on in relation to differences in how states have responded to Russia's violations of IHL in contrast to Israel's violations of IHL. And that states do need to call out these things, because if they don't, the old rule that silence is acquiescence. So in being silent, you accept that that is how the rule is, will have extremely damaging effects.
I'm going to let you come in also because I know you would probably want to comment on the not giving up on the rule-based order, but a comment back to what Sally is saying, and also, if not putting words in your mouth, but saying that there's a double standard perhaps, and how that is affecting also the compliance or how states are handling different conflicts differently. Is that something that you recognize or want to comment, Laurent?
Yes, very much so. I think states view different conflicts differently in various parts of the world, and depending on how they situate themselves vis-à-vis the conflict, but also depending on the type of conflict. And I was very interested to hear what you mentioned in drawing back the worrying trend that I mentioned to some of the Gulf War. And I think that's very true, because that comes often when there is higher intensity conflicts, as if the IHL was too restrictive for high intensity conflicts. But let's remember when the Geneva Convention were adopted. That's after Second World War. That's the highest intensity conflict ever on Earth. And that's on that basis that IHL was developed and was agreed by state by people who had experienced firsthand what occurred then. And afterwards, also the additional protocol based on all the conflicts that occurred in the period. So any claim that IHL should be understood more permissively because we are now in a different situations, because that's a high intensity, because of this, because of that. Let's remember of the persons who drafted those treaties and the states who adopted them, what they had experienced. So I think that's in terms of the trends, that's very important. Now, you wanted me to comment on the point that I forgot now. Sorry for that.
It's okay. I want to give the word to Ulrika as well, and then we can both remember it. On the rule-based order, I think Sally is saying states haven't given up on the rule-based order.
Yeah.
Would you
No,
agree?
and I think also before my service with the Swedish Red Cross and our movement, I was in the UN, and I saw firsthand as well how the division between North and South and East and West was increasing alongside with polarization and population. And I think the double standards are extremely damaging to a trend that has also surfaced also because of other matters, such as the view, right or wrong, on what actually happened during the pandemic with regards to the global commitment to actually see to that we all got vaccines. So I think also this discussion has to be made within kind of a broader discussion on how different states or people, also an actor's view. And I think it's also very important to see that throughout the past decades that you referred to, we've also seen so many conflicts also with non-state actors. And of course, making them comply as much as we wish is perhaps more difficult than to make states who have actually signed off on this based on the experience comply. So I think there's always perhaps more accountability, even though we want to have all parties accountable for this and sign up towards states, and they really need to stand the ground.
Laurent, you're reminding us of when these rules were actually documented, and because I want to get back to the question that I think is heard quite often now, like we can't adhere to IHL when we're not expecting our opponent to do the same, and that is, I think, a question and argument that comes up quite often now. And at the same time, I want to quote the Minister of Defense of Ukraine in their voluntary report on IHL from, I think, last year. In the preface of the report, he said, I'm deeply convinced that law must not vanish at war. To the contrary, the extreme conditions of war are an ultimate test for legal obligations so solemnly declared in times of peace and prosperity, and so frequently, unfortunately, forgotten in times of war and misery. But still, these questions kind of echo currently, I'd say. What is the ICRC response? You said it before, but meeting that question.
I would need to maybe read the quote to be certain of what I'm going to say, but I think that's a very wise statement that I could
I'm thinking more of the
much
questions
echo.
if we meet the question of our country or our belligerents, we can expect to adhere to IHL when the opponents don't.
I think so. First, that's a basic tenet of international humanitarian law, that it must be respected regardless of what the opponent do. And there are several reasons for that. The first reason, if that's not the case, that's a downward spiral. Of course, then if one party say the opponent doesn't respect it and then starts doing behavior that are not compliant, either then the first party will say, oh, but look, there is the non-compliant behavior, so turning to worse behavior to worse and worse and worse. And that's the end of international humanitarian law, or at least of its respect. The other reason is that international humanitarian law is meant to protect a person who are not fighting. They are meant to protect civilians, they are meant to protect combatants hors de combat, prisoner of war, etc. So those persons are no longer fighting. They are meant to require you to make distinctions between military objective and civilian objects, and that goes together with achieving victory, actually. The better you discriminate and the better you target only military objectives, the better you can win the war. So in that sense, military efficiency and humanitarian law often go hand in hand, actually. So the reasons to not violate the law because the opponents violate it has no validity in terms of humanity, because that's a downward trend, and it's not helpful military either. IHL is based on a balance between military necessity and humanity that's embedded into international humanitarian law, including the aspect of respecting the law even when the opponent does not respect it. The last aspect to it is, of course, looking the ability in a way to look oneself in the mirror, if I can put it this way, because very often when a party to the conflict is taking that argument, that very often comes with very strong words against the opposing arguments, and how the opposing arguments is morally reprehensible, beyond legally reprehensible, but non-state armed group, they are terrorists, etc., and same between states. So then that means if you start having the same behavior or take argument from that behavior to do the same, then what does it mean for yourself, actually?
So these are the trends.
Can I add to that?
If it's super short, because I also want to get into what we then can do, because I know that a lot is being done.
I think there's also there's two elements. I think the reciprocity point is very important to raise. And the military necessity point. But I also think there's again, taking the context of the broader international legal system, if you do not comply with your obligations under international humanitarian law, why would another state maybe not engage with you in the armed conflict, have any trust or faith that you will comply with your trade obligations or any other negotiations or behavior that you may be conducting as part of state? So these have much broader implications, and particularly we'll be talking of the Ottawa Convention on Anti-Personnel Mines. There was a lot of work by the EU and by EU member states and Western states to convince other states that were engaged in armed conflicts to actually not use and sign up to the convention at the time. And now with changes and trends in that, this has a big impact on how other states perceive your behavior. I also think it's remarkable that we kind of forget that states are made up of people. States representatives are people. We teach our children just because someone hit you, you can't hit them back. But this seems to be forgotten when we operate on the state level.
Good point. You gave me a perfect, what we say in Swedish, radioövergång, to also show another little clip. But first of that, I want to ask the audience some questions, and then we will get also into what we then can do or what is actually being done, because I know there's a lot of initiatives, not at least from the ICRC. But let me ask, we just mentioned anti-personnel mines. How many here have heard of anti-personnel mines before? And how many have heard that there was a treaty banning them?
knowledgeable audience.
I know. How many have heard of autonomous weapons or autonomous weapon systems? How many have heard of killer robots? Just another word for used
A lot of
by
hands up.
some. Yeah. Still, we wanted to show a short clip on the effects of the anti-personnel mine ban.
If the global convention banning anti-personnel landmines had never been agreed, would it matter? What difference has it made? In 2023 alone, almost 694 square kilometres of land was made safe to walk on, thanks to the treaty. Since the treaty came into force in 1999, over 55 million anti-personnel mines that were in stock ready to harm have been destroyed. In Cambodia, in the 1990s, mines and unexploded ordnance killed or injured thousands of people each year. Today, that number has fallen to less than 100 deaths or injuries a year. Around the world, many lives, limbs and livelihoods have been saved, with many survivors having dedicated victim support services, thanks to the treaty. And if these figures aren't enough to persuade us that weapon bans make a difference, let's look at the impact on someone's life. Weapon ban treaties limit suffering in war and its aftermath. The International Committee of the Red Cross.
Yes. So another question. How many of you know that several European states have decided to stop their withdrawal process? As Sally said, there are some treaties where it's actually an opening that you can withdraw from treaties. Also a knowledge. There's a reason why you're here. Yes. So how about we talk a bit about that? Also a trend of countries, as you said, that argued for this treaty are now leaving it. Any comments on that trend?
Do you want to?
Should I start?
You start.
Okay.
I see. Position.
Thank you for raising that question, but I would avoid saying that's a trend. I hope, first of all, that it will not occur, and I will come back to that, and that if it does, that it remains an exception. We are, of course, at the ICRC, but more broadly in the movement, gravely concerned by the indication that there are a number of states that have taken that decision to abandon and withdraw from the convention banning anti-personnel mines. We have been very public about that with our partners here, the Swedish Red Cross Society and all the Red Cross Society in the Nordic and Baltic countries in that respect. We are very concerned because reintroducing those appalling weapons would be a deeply troubling step backwards. They have very limited military utility. That has been demonstrated and assessed, including by military experts, not by the ICRC, because some would say that we have a biased view, but we relied on studies and endorsement by independent military experts, not from ICRC. Already 30 years ago, that the anti-personnel mines had very limited military utility. And that can only have diminished since, because there have been a huge development in technologies, in how wars are fought with new technologies. So the military utility of those old weapons can only have further diminished, if they had any. Some speak of smart mines, just to clarify. They usually speak of mines that self-destruct or self-deactivate. That are systems that existed 30 years ago, before the Ottawa Convention was created. So they are not particularly smart. They are rather old, I would say. And state at the time had assessed that they raise the same problem and they need to be covered by the prohibition of anti-personnel mines. That's different from remotely controlled mines. If they are remotely controlled, so the detonation of the mine is done by an operator, not by a victim stepping on it or a human stepping on it. If they are remotely controlled, they are not prohibited. So even state party can use it when they are remotely controlled. Now, they have little military utility, but they have devastating humanitarian consequences. And that remained the case today. That hasn't changed. It's overwhelmingly civilians who get killed by anti-personnel mines. It's children, it's farmers. And that lasts decades after the end of the conflict, Think of Cambodia, where there was the latest meeting of state parties on that treaty. Think of the Balkans 30 years ago, closer to us. They are still affected by mines.
I think I'm just thinking, because you were quite good at just saying that this is not a trend. At least you hope so, and that was good. And I felt, thank you. And I was just now referencing back to the fact that you said that we have another trend actually with states joining treaties rather, but perhaps not being in the news. The UK joining, which treaty was it?
The Protocol on Explosive Weapons Remnants.
Exactly.
It's not the most exciting process, though.
It is though, but
It's a very important one.
It's a very important one. Yeah.
so how do you
absolutely.
view these countries move in a bigger context?
I think it's part of a change, as we talked about, this change within the international security. The international security is changing. This is a reaction. I work on the behalf of the Swedish government, so I won't comment on whether, I think it's a good or a bad or whatever. I'll leave that to Ola. But I think as you were kind of mentioning of, what we think about for this, the possible use in the future, if they go through this, because this is a process they've indicated withdrawal that will have to then go through their national domestic processes. There will be a debate, obviously, relating to that. And then you'll deposit a withdrawal notice to the UN Secretary General and Security Council and so on and so forth. And then it would, there's a process involved here. But I think thinking in terms of these mines, what could be used in the future? As Laurent said, there is no smart mine, there is no incredible development within the research on this. I'm not an engineer, so there may be others who have different perspectives, but the likelihood is that they're going to be using mines that they have in the stockpile or that are readily available. And those are the mines that we were trying to address with the Ottawa Convention. So in terms of have things changed from a humanitarian perspective, those mines have the same problems. And as you've mentioned, these mines have problems not only in the short term, but in the significant long term, which is why the explosive remnants protocol, I think, is a really important one to think about, because it's from 2003. We often think, not the international humanitarian law doesn't develop. It does, and it includes treaties and it includes these things. And we are working to address new and newly understood effects of armed conflict, and that's one really important example, I think.
What role does, as you said, states are made up of people. What role does a movement mean in this context? You represent the Swedish Red Cross. I'm sure we have other colleagues from the Swedish civil society here. Do we need to remind, leading question, do we really mean to remind our society of the humanitarian consequences? I'm thinking just of numbers that came out of the ICRC that just up to I think April, 500 people died of personnel mines in Syria, for instance. Not necessarily in the news again.
Yeah. No, I think when it comes to these mines that are not smart, it's so upfront when you look at the numbers that civilians are the ones who actually pay the price for this kind of warfare. But I think it's not necessarily known, even though it seems that there are a lot of knowledgeable people in this room. I think there is a need to remind and also show what it takes, but also what it takes to economies. We know that mine clearing in many of the countries where Sweden has been engaged, for instance, through International Development Cooperation, it has taken decades and decades. You're also accompanying this. So, of course, it also takes a toll on the economy. While we have also problems of climate change and lands not being brought back into the economy. So there are once again different complex happenings at the same time that actually people have to pay the price for upfront as they meet the situation, but also I think in the long term and also for countries as such. But I also wanted to mention that I think what is important and interesting also with regards to the survey, once again, that we've done here in Sweden is that 3 out of 10 Swedes are actually concerned, very concerned, that war or armed conflict could happen in Sweden. And I think this brings us the sad opportunity also to remind Swedes, because of course many times as Swedes, but also in other countries, we have watched the conflicts on the television, but really thinking, what would this mean in our context? Perhaps could also bring a more thoughtful and also informed discussion, I think, ahead of any direction of change that would potentially happen.
That gives me a second radioövergång to welcome Ola Engdahl up to the stage. You are a legal advisor for the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we've invited you for the thankful task of representing Sweden in this conversation. Again, having a more informed discussion on these issues. Sweden has always been a vocal advocate for international law and part of many of the treaties that we're discussing. And I think we will move now into a bit on what we can do. But let's first start with what Sweden can do and what Sweden is doing.
Thank you.
What are we doing?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me for the opportunity to address these central questions of international law that we have heard today. Yeah, what are Sweden doing? Sweden has consistently reaffirmed that international law is a cornerstone, a starting point or a central value in Sweden's foreign policy. And we also have a significant security interest to uphold a rules-based environment among us. And when we talk about compliance, I think it might first and foremost talk about the question. There is a question of ensuring accountability for states and individuals for breaches of international law. But strengthening compliance is much more than that. And I think there can also be a question of being actively engaged in processes, as the current work on lethal autonomous weapon systems and the working group on cyber and security, where Sweden is a clear supporter for the need of compliance of international law in general and IHL, international humanitarian law in particular. One important aspect in this regard is the so-called Article 36 mechanism, where states are obliged to secure that new means and methods are in compliance with IHL before they put them to use. And Sweden is in fact one of a limited number of states that has such a mechanism, named the Delegation for International Humanitarian Law Monitoring of Arms Projects. In relation to cyber threats, Sweden has, like a number of other states and international organizations, shared its position on international law, including IHL, and the use of cyber means. It's also particularly welcome that both the African Union and the European Union have provided interpretations of international law in this respect. Sweden has moreover been a long-term advocate for including a gender perspective in the application of IHL to ensure non-discriminatory and equal application of the law, ensuring that all individuals are granted the protection and rights to which they are entitled under international law. But in terms of accountability then, Sweden is a strong supporter of the International Criminal Court, ICC. We have seconded prosecutors, criminal investigators to the ICC, and is also the largest contributor to the ICC Victims Fund. Sweden furthermore applies universal jurisdiction in international law, and Swedish prosecutor, together with a special unit of investigators at the police, have been very successful to prosecute persons suspected of committed war crimes in other states. And last but not least, as we have heard Sally talked about, it's of course of utmost importance to stand up for the rules and be clear that in all armed conflict, the parties must comply with their obligations under IHL. Civilians must be protected, and only military objectives must be targeted. It's important to voice concern when civilians are directly targeted or when attacks are directed against healthcare or humanitarian workers or where other rules of IHL are violated. So compliance is a central importance to the system of international law as a whole. And I think the problem is not so much the lack of rules, but rather compliance with existing law. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola. And I think you mentioned several of the things that already came up in the conversation. And I think we keep coming back to that there are rules. Most states still uphold them, but there's a permissive discussion that has been, I don't know, if not a trend, but a worrisome tendency for quite some time. And you keep coming back to accountability. So what can we then do? Because I think and I want to have two strings of discussions before we close this discussion. One is what we do more generally to uphold them. And I think it's interesting what reminding ourselves of what you said, Sally, that states are made up of people, all of us. And the second one is the new types of warfare. How do we address that? Because when we're talking about accountability, do we then need a human that we can hold accountable when we're talking about autonomous weapon systems, for instance? But let's start with the first kind of string. What can we do more broadly to counter this more permissive discussion or the lack of accountability more broadly? You look like you want to comment.
Yeah, I just want to repeat what I said before, and I actually think that perhaps we should do it together or with researchers, look into again how respect for IGL actually has enabled better negotiated solutions and also better lasting peace of quality, if I may call it that today. Because I think because of the many conflicts and the complexity of the world, people are also closing their eyes because there is a sensation, I think, among people, and it's so fascinating that so many people in Sweden want to support international humanitarian law and want also accountability, but still, how do you do it? I think arguments need also to build on, as you were looking for, what are the opportunities then? What could this bring? And I think also, of course, we are really the organization with all the history to tell those stories, but I think we need to bring them more to the forefront. I think IHL and all of these matters that as lawyers have become too technical sometimes, and we need to not make the discussion populistic, but a bit more popular perhaps. Easier to understand and to actually easier to be discussed. I must say, though, that I think a lot of the injustice that we see in the warfare of today, and I think we've both mentioned Gaza, for instance, in front of our eyes these weeks, but we could also mention Sudan, we could also mention Ukraine, and so many of the ongoing conflicts make people really upset. So I think a lot of people are looking for arguments.
Yes. Do you want to comment?
Yes, thanks. And thanks for mentioning the question of researching how better respect for international humanitarian law has helped peace and achieving and sustaining peace afterwards, because that's precisely one aspect that we are looking at part of one thing that we have launched with several states, and we hope all states will join, which is a global initiative to galvanize political support for international humanitarian law that we launched last autumn. And one of the aspects we are looking at is precisely the relationship between international humanitarian law and compliance with the law and peace, and how that has supported peace. So that's more broadly beyond that specific questions, but that was exactly what you mentioned. That's a response that we have launched with states. Many more states than the 6 initial states have now joined. You can see that there was a very strong communique actually last week by 27 states around that initiative after a meeting in New York to really strengthen and galvanize more compliance with international humanitarian law. And we are looking at very different topics, one of them IHL and peace, but also others that I mentioned earlier: protection of hospitals, protection of civilian infrastructure, new technologies of warfare, also notably ICTs, cyber operations, so in the use of information communication technologies, but often referred to as cyber operations, and how the law protects, because you mentioned very rightly that the legal review in Article 36, the legal review of new weapons, is an extremely important tool. But sometimes new technologies, and that's the case for cyber operations, they raise new questions of how the law applies. For example, how does international humanitarian law protect data, digital data, because that did not exist in 1977. And you can understand the law in different ways, whether or not everybody, almost everybody agrees that international humanitarian law does apply to cyber operations and put limits in cyber operations. But now if you say, yes, but the effects on data, that's not traditionally understood as an effect that we look at in IHL, so therefore we don't count that effect. That a bit diminish the value of saying international humanitarian law applies and put into question how the law today would protect against the effects of those operations. So there are values in looking at the new technologies beyond Article 36 to precisely then be able to inform Article 36 on how the law is understood, how the law is potentially have been developed on that aspect. And I think you also mentioned autonomous weapons. That's a domain where we believe the law needs to be developed and urgently. So new rules in addition to existing rules, and that will inform Article 36 review from our perspective.
I think there's like the legal tools is one way forward, and then the other one is making those legal tools about humans. I think what you're talking about is having both of those working simultaneously so that there is pressure for the legal tools to be applied and developed, and then having the human side to have the political pressure, because I think we're also talking about political pressure here and making sure that states actually stand up. The president of the ICRC said just recently, as the head of a neutral and impartial humanitarian organization working across front lines, I find it extremely difficult to witness entire populations trapped in a self-defeating prisoner's dilemma that the world sought to overcome when it adopted the UN Charter. So how do we overcome? Again, we have very standing up for the rules that already are and applying them to new type of warfare, but then at the same time this permissive. How do we get to that?
I think, again, looking at the system as a whole, we have more mechanisms to ensure accountability and compliance today than we have ever had before. We have more cases before national courts relating to international crimes and more cases before the ICC than has ever happened before. And the ICC, for all that it has a limited number of cases, reaches out to more victims than we've been able to in history, just generally. And then we have the UN inquiries that are set up. We have all kinds of other processes. We're touching on autonomous weapons. We have from the other side, the International Telecommunications Union, UNESCO, looking at AI and autonomy and things like that as well. We have a huge set of systems that are going on and mechanisms in place now to ensure. So again, I think there is an element of we need to ensure compliance, yes, and we need to ensure accountability, absolutely. We have more ways of doing it. You mentioned the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. We have more cases before the International Court of Justice relating to these armed conflicts now than we have previously. So the states are using mechanisms, they're creating mechanisms. You mentioned about the processes to come up with new laws relating to autonomous weapons. It's also creating a space where states are starting to have a discussion about AI in military use. And it's kind of coming in through a back door, but it's starting. That discussion is starting. So there is processes, and international legal rules don't only develop through treaties, they develop through state practice continuously over time on the belief that these are legal norms that they must comply with. So I think it's also then really important to put that in the context as well of, yes, we have these terrible violations, but we also have mechanisms and differences of ensuring accountability than we've ever had before.
You're humming when Sally is talking, and I wanted to ask you actually what a quite small country as Sweden can do in this aspect, defeating the prisoner's dilemma. You mentioned financing the ICC. What more can be done? I know we already talked about autonomous weapons, for instance, and the development of not only treaties but also practice. But where is Sweden when it comes to those currently?
Well, as I said, we are participating in those processes, and we are very safeguarding the respect for international humanitarian law, and we also in other processes like in cyber, in space, we also are clear that international humanitarian law do apply. There is also that discussion in some respects. And accountability is, of course, very, very important. And we support ICC. We also have been very much involved in the work on accountability both for states and individuals in relation to Ukraine. And I think that's a lot of good examples in that respect.
But I'm thinking, because we are partnering now to do a study, and that will be useful for you. And I think also the study that we've done also with regards to the huge support amongst Swedes, I think it's important to bring to the forefront also to politicians and decision makers. Because maybe there is in this debate that is so polarized an idea of decision makers that there is not enough of support, while we can see that maybe there is more support and maybe things are moving in the right direction. And one direction that we saw together was during also the conference we had, where we actually, in the midst of all this mess that the world is in, we were able, as the movement and with the state parties to the movement, also to actually take a decision on new technologies and warfare.
And also compliance. I mean, it was an important step that we, during this time, could all agree on these resolutions, I think.
Yes. We don't have the political side here with us today, but that perhaps the next conversation to bring our, as you said, we're bringing our data from our poll and our news today to parliamentarians and politicians, but reminding ourselves again, I think I've said it 4 times now, states are made up of people, and having that reminder. Thank you all. I'm going to end. You have a last.
Yes, I thought I will just, I want to share also the good example. We heard a lot of that there's a threat to the system of international law, but I think there are also good examples. If I have the time to.
If you can do it in about 1 minute, you're welcome.
Okay, that will be quite difficult. But I mean, the acts that's been taken by the international community after the Russian invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Security Council has been prevented to act, but the General Assembly acted, and we have now created a register of damage. A claims commission is on the move. We are now completed the work on the technical and legal work on the new special tribunal for the crime of aggression. And as we have heard, the ICJ, ICC is more active than ever. I think so. If there is a political will, the legal tools are there. So I think it's too early to say that the legal system as such is threatened. There are many good examples when states come together, because the law is there to use.
I think that gives me a reason to say one last quote before I give the word to Ulrika. And we can continue this discussion because we are offering you some drinks and snacks after this. But I wanted to end with a quote and then let you summarize, because I read this just today. And I think it ties into what you said. Hope is not a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. It's an axe you break down doors in emergency. Hope should shove you out the door. And I think that kind of resonates with the political will. I will leave it to you, Ulrika, to summarize this conversation. Please.
I'm not sure, or at least give us summarize. I think, let's final do that in the conversation. And I think there is much more to be said. But thank you so much. It's great to have partners in this from research, of course, our close partner in ICRC, and from the Swedish government, and to have such a knowledgeable audience. And now I need to give you a heads up in the audience that what we're doing here is to create a scene, as you can tell. Some of you have been with us before. We want to have an inclusive, informed discussion with a broad range of actors in the Swedish and international context, because we want to be part of change. We want to be that axe, and we also want you to voice what you have heard here today. So please go into our website and look for the survey we've done, look for other information that we have, and be our voice as well as you speak to others who are perhaps less informed than you are. And then we're not letting the speakers off the hook, because you're actually here, not here, but with us tomorrow as well. So I just wanted to share with you as an audience that we are having a symposium tomorrow with the headline Law of Armed Conflict at the Swedish Defense University. And it's a Nordic symposium. Did I say that? If so, I said it twice. So, of course, we have reasons also to really look at this, not only from the Swedish perspective and the Swedish Red Cross. We're working very closely. I just, some weeks ago, joined colleagues in Tromsø in Norway. We are working very closely with the Nordic, with the Baltic, and doing that also as part of our amazing international movement and accompanying also some of the work that is being done by the states also in the Arctic. So do accompany us and tell us if you need more information, if you want to engage with us, because we want to make change happen. And I truly believe, and Josephine, you also always used to say that hope is something you do really through action. And I think we need more of both hope and action. So that's a good combination then. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm looking forward to the continued discussions tomorrow as well. Yeah.
Mhm.